Hey everybody, welcome back to a new videos channel. And today we're not in the usual place, no, we are in Japan, and let's talk with Evan Yu about VoidZero. All right, we're here at VueFes 2024, at least very close by. And well, with me here is the creator of Vue and Vite and the founder of VoidZero, Evan Yu. How are you doing, Evan?
Good, yeah.
So yeah, we're here to discuss everything about your new company, the new project. It's been quite a few weeks since you dropped the ball announcing the funding of the company, and maybe it'd be good for everyone maybe not reading the announcement blog post or the keynote at ViteConf. Links, of course, in the description for everybody out there. Should definitely do that. To summarize, maybe in like 2-3 sentences, what VoidZero is about.
Sure. So VoidZero is built on top of a few existing open source projects, namely Vite, Test, oxc, and Rolldown. And our aim is to unify the vision of these projects and build a unified, coherent toolchain for JavaScript and potentially, associated services around that toolchain.
Yeah, we'll get to the services definitely later on. So maybe let's start in the past very much. When do you think you had the first idea, the first vision of what VoidZero is now and will become? Like when you had the idea for the big picture, let's say.
I would say when I realized Vite is gaining so much traction that it's essentially becoming a shared infrastructure layer between a lot of these different web frameworks and tools. I think this level of convergence is something that's very rarely seen in the JavaScript ecosystem, because if there is one thing that we can summarize the JavaScript ecosystem is that it's so, in a negative way it's fragmented. In a good way it's diverse.
True,
right?
Good point.
I think it's a double-edged sword in many ways. Mostly because JavaScript evolved from a very crude, simple scripting language to the most used language today. So people are essentially pushing it to its limits, using it to build things that it just wasn't designed for in the first place, right? So over that period, we need all these tools to support these expanding use cases. So people come up with these solutions one by one, right? By different people at different time, So inevitably, there are just all these incompatibilities or inconsistencies or overlapping responsibilities between all these tools. I think the nice thing about this is we essentially, collectively created all the things we actually need, right? So we do have solutions to almost every engineering problem in JavaScript today. And the downside is we have to essentially in every project pull in hundreds of dependencies and try to configure them, make sure they work together, and make sure we actually get what we want, right? So I think in a way that has been the case for example, the build tool, right? In Vue CLI, we had a very long time, we had to just we basically did the job of putting together all these things for Vue users and try to give them a more streamlined experience at the end. And at one point I was thinking there must be a simpler way to do this, because I still felt Vue CLI was a bit too over-engineered, too complicated, right? So Vite wasn't kind of an attempt to rethink how the toolchain should work for Vue in the beginning. But at a later time, halfway through working on Vite and refactoring it, I realized, okay, a lot of these ideas apply to, it's not Vue specific anymore.
Yeah, it works for all the frameworks, right?
Yeah, we can use it to support other frameworks too, and can make things simpler for them too, right? So I think that proved to be a really good idea, because then a lot of other frameworks started adopting Vite, and then the trend that I talked about appeared. We see more and more frameworks are adopting Vite and using it as the default toolchain to build on. So that's the moment I realized we're onto something, right? This is for the first time you see all these different frameworks are opting to use the same thing, and the magic appears because now the same Vite plugin can be used in Remix, in SvelteKit, in Next, which was just not possible before, right? So what happens if we bring this common shared infrastructure even deeper down to the whole JavaScript ecosystem, right? I think there will be more positive effects. So that is, I think that's the fundamental reason why I want to, pursue this idea. And part of the reason why we started the company is because it's a very ambitious undertaking, right?
It's true. I mean, it's a whole thing for the whole JavaScript ecosystem, right? And that's also, like, we talk a lot about front end, but also all the frameworks going full stack and even taking a look at the back end. Like, JavaScript's everywhere, right?
So honestly, ironically, I don't, as someone who successfully made something like Vue sustainable over the years, I also know the limits of the funding model that we're using for Vue. Right, it's probably enough to sustain a few, maybe like 2 to 3 full-time developers. Plus, we sponsor some developers on our team to work on it in their part-time. They still need a day job to support their living. So that's pretty much the limit of the way Vue operates. And Vue is already a very successful outlier among all the independent projects. Right?
Absolutely.
So something at the scope of a unified toolchain for JavaScript, that's not something we can do just based on donations or sponsorships, right? You need buy-in from, you either need a foundation with buy-in from big enterprise willing to pull a lot of resources together to make this happen, which is very difficult because it's hard to align incentives for this between these companies, right? So the other option is we find ways to get enough money to build a team ourselves, to work on this full time.
And that's what kind of happened with the $4.6 million funding you got now from companies like Excel, from from investors like Matt Bielman, for example. Lots of people, also you all named them in the announcement blog post. But maybe also let's go a little bit back, because I think the funding, it was announced earlier this month. And it was secured, I think, like in 2023.
Yeah, it was actually closed last year. Yeah.
So maybe even go further back. When did you found the company that we now know as VoidZero? Like, when did you make the step to create that company?
So the company was registered, I think, August 2023. Funding closed a few months, 1 or 2 months after that. But the first idea, I think, kind of started when I was in Singapore at a friend's company's kind of a gathering, when some developers who are now part VoidZero employees, they were visiting Singapore, visiting a friend's company in Singapore, and I was just there to hang out. And we were chatting about front-end technologies and JavaScript. And so the friend who is also the founder of the company was like, so you have Evan here, and then we also have folks who worked on some like projects like RSPack at ByteDance. Like they work on supporting very like large-scale front-end infrastructure projects, and their experience in that. And we're talking about Vite and where the future JavaScript tooling is, and it just felt like, there's the Vite trend. There are people who are working on similar things, but also interested in the vision that Vite is pointing towards. So that kind of kickstarted a conversation, like maybe this can be a company, right? Because one thing about starting a company is you not only need the vision, but you also need the right people to build it.
Definitely.
Right. So, so part of the reason why it all came together is because I got to talk to a few people who are experts in this field and also interested in working towards this vision. So, but of course, if we don't have the proper funding to allow them to work on that vision full time, this would not happen.
That's true.
So that's when I started thinking about, we need to raise money.
Makes sense. So the company's name VoidZero.
Yeah.
Did you come up with the name yourself? How did it happen?
Yeah. Funny enough, in the beginning, I was struggling picking a name, so we just temporarily called it Vite Labs.
Oh, okay, like Talent Labs, next to this one.
We called it Vite Labs, but at a later stage, we discovered there was a crypto company called Vite.
Oh, the crypto coin, yeah.
The crypto company is literally called Vite Labs.
Oh, yeah, okay,
Yeah,
that's tricky.
so
then.
it's like just a pure name conflict, and they actually have the name Vite Labs registered on GitHub, on LinkedIn, and we found out too late. So I decided to find a better name, a different name. So VoidZero is a play on the. It's a valid JavaScript expression. If you write VoidZero, it evaluates to undefined.
Yes.
Because the void is in fact a keyword and an operator. So it just turns everything after it into undefined.
Which is a funny play, especially also instead of undefined, using VoidZero, it's smaller.
Yeah,
as well.
it's also like when you use a minifier to compress undefined, it compresses into VoidZero.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So to my opinion, they're like Vite Labs. It feels like it's very much sticking around Vite as like the central tool. And while I think like VoidZero is more open, as you have now, like you have the whole oxc topic, you have Rolldown, you have Vitess, like you have a lot of projects under the same umbrella.
Yeah.
And in that way, it's like, in a way, of course, Vite is still a central piece, but it's detached, not that focused on it.
Exactly, yeah. I think part of the reason of picking the new name is also because of that. Because like we don't want to give the people impression that, the company is essentially like completely taking Vite and trying to commercialize Vite. That's not the point, right? We want to keep building open source, keep contributing to open source. And our monetization is not about turning Vite into a money generating machine. That's not the play here, right?
And there, just to double down on that, I know you mentioned it countless times, but everything that's released right now under the open source MIT license will stay open source.
Of course, yes.
Good.
So everything that we maintain as open source will remain open source, will remain the same license forever, because we don't ever plan to monetize based on, say, now we change the license and you need to pay money to use Vite. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, perfect. So everybody watching now, you can be a bit more relieved. So VoidZero now, the team page came up like a couple days ago, like a week, I think. So who's on the VoidZero team, and maybe also the extended team, like advisors, people around the ecosystem? Maybe just a brief overview of the people working there.
Sure. So we have internally, we have sub-team that's focused on oxc, of course. So there's Borschen, who's project lead, Overlook Motel. We call him Jim. He's a bit more like to stay undercover, but Jim is kind of like the optimization wizard, very deep knowledge about Rust optimizations and very knowledgeable. And then Deng Qing, mostly working on the transformers. He's been a very impressive contributor to the transform pipelines and also doing a lot of pushing out the transform features really, really fast. So that's the oxc side of things. Then extended, we also have oxc contributors that we sponsor. Don Isaac contributes to the linter a lot, and then we have a few more contributors that have either contributed in the past or have been making active contributions. We also sponsor them. And then on the Rolldown side, it's mostly from ex-ByteDance folks who worked on RSPack. So they have deep expertise in Rust bundler space. So that's one of the reasons we are confident we can actually build a bundler that is able to fulfill the needs of Vite, right? It's not easy and it requires prior experience to that. And Borschen also kind of worked to support some of the RSPack things when he was working at ByteDance, right? So there's VueFes and Xiangjun. Xiangjun's idea is like, I want to be that guy on GitHub. And then Li Kui. Li Kui actually was a Vue contributor and Vite contributor.
That's interesting.
In the past.
Yeah.
He was a very early Vite contributor. Was quite helpful during the Vite 2.0 phase. Unfortunately, he then went to work for ByteDance and kind of like stopped doing open source, but now we got him back.
Sweet. That's a nice returning story. Great.
Yeah, and then on the Vite side, so we also hired a few core contributors of Vite, so Safi, Hiroshi, and then Vladimir, who is now the lead maintainer of VueFes, of course, right? So I think that should cover everyone.
Nice. And on the advisor side, like people that are not full-time working?
Right, so we have an advisor who is Brooklyn, who's the author of NAPIs, an API, which is the way that allows Rust and Node.js to talk to each other very nicely. So most of our work relies on that. So
it makes sense to have him as an advisor on board.
Yeah, he helps a lot on some of the technical stuff under the hood.
Yeah. Okay, sweet. So we already talked about the business side, and you mentioned why like funding and the business was necessary, given your experience with Vite and Vue, and that let's say the open source sponsorship model doesn't allow hiring just a bunch of people working full time on the vision.
Yep.
So then of course the question comes with the funding, and of course lots of people react to like, oh, VC funding, open source. We all know some horror stories there, and I think there are also some misconceptions out there, especially in preparation for the interview. I heard some interesting takes there. So maybe it would be just interesting to hear why you decided on taking VC money, what other options were there maybe, and especially how you found the right investors.
Yeah. So first of all, I think a lot of people are kind of allergic to hearing the term VC and open source combined together. But I think despite being an independent dev myself for almost like 10 years, I never look at this as a black and white problem, right? There are successful stories of open source taking VC money, growing to successful companies while still staying true to open source, right? I don't think that's just impossible. It can be hard to do, right? But a lot of it depends on the execution, the team, the project. It's just very case dependent, right? It's not black and white. The second is saying for the idea of taking VC money, the terms and the arrangement and the power structure can vary just wildly different depending on companies, right? Most of the horror stories we hear are actually companies or projects being taken over completely by private equity firms, or right. So when you give out the control entirely, then the firm will probably try to squeeze out as much of a profit as possible. But for example, for our seed stage, right, all the investors combined control less than 18% of the company. So
and you have the rest?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right. And then we have stock options, of course, for the team members.
Yes.
And then the investors don't have any board seats. So we retain absolute control of the company. We control the vision for our open source efforts, right? So in other words, it is up to me to decide whether we should, whether these open source projects will stay true to open source. And I think in a lot of ways, it comes down to whether do you trust me to do the right thing for these projects, right?
I've seen it also a lot. People like skeptical, especially with this VC part as you mentioned, but then they're also like, oh yeah, Avenue, the guy behind Vue, Vite, he has a track record of successful open source projects and he won't do anything harming open source. Yeah. But I think like mentioning the whole topic about shares and that you don't give up control is a very important part there. Just so once again, people are aware like, okay, you are still in control. And even though, of course, the investors have some shares in that, they want at some point also ROI and become to monetization also in a bit. It's still like your vision. And in the end, you also chose partners like Axel, for example, that align with that.
Totally. So we talked to, obviously, during fundraising, we will talk to multiple different VCs. And we kind of instantly get a sense of whether they understand what we're trying to do and whether they are on board with that vision, right? Some will immediately jump to sort of more direct questions like, how do you make money? How big is the market? When do you expect to be able to start making money? And to be honest, we do have a plan, right? But our plan is intentionally kind of for the long run. Like a lot of it relies on us building the right toolchain first. And we only work with partners who believe in that vision and believe the pace and the strategy that we have planned out will work. We will only take their money if they're okay with that, right? So that's important in picking investors. And I guess for some companies, maybe they don't have the room or leisure to just like pick the investors they like the best. But for us, luckily, I think we were able to just go with the investors that we see that, okay, like they buy into the vision, they understand that, they're willing to give us the freedom and flexibility to do things our way.
Yeah, and also like not jumping straight to like, okay, when can we get ROI? When is the money there? Yeah. So that also means you said like for the long run, which means not a couple months, but like multiple years. Yeah. So as you said, you're focusing on technical part first, getting that right. Yeah. And as you also mentioned that you had maybe the luxury to talk with a lot of VCs that are interested in the project, also the vision, that also comes from the 0 to 1 problem that you don't really have to compare to former projects that also try to be a unified toolchain in a way.
Yeah, I think obviously the raise is based a lot on the traction of the open source project that we've already built. So it's not like we're pitching an idea out of the blue and say, we're going to build this amazing build tool called Vite, and it's going to be the most popular thing in 2 years from now, right? That's just like kind of giving promise out of thin air. Yeah. Like when we raise money, Vite is already on an upgrowing trajectory, and the trend shows that. And a year since we've raised, Vite continues to grow, and the growth just doubled in the past year. Given like a year ago, it was already at 7 million weekly downloads, and now it's more than double of that.
Which is like an insane growth as well.
Yeah.
Even though, of course, like download metrics are always a bit tricky because there's a lot of legacy, but it still shows a trend.
Yeah.
And also that you mentioned before, like every modern framework except Next.js nowadays is using Vite in their core, is also showing where the ecosystem moves. Because once again, before like, oh yeah, sure, roll up there, webpack there, and also like some systems around it. And now the unification is in a way already happening. It just needs to go the next step, as you mentioned before.
Just a point about, I see some people like complaining NPM downloads is useless metrics. Like the absolute number itself doesn't really mean much, but like you can argue that there are like CI downloads, repeated downloads, improper caching, but like it's the same for every package on NPM.
That's true.
So if you compare the same type of packages across the same category, the relative numbers and trends still makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Absolutely. It's more like all the legacy applications out there that might have been built with Webpack, and you don't do things in terms of like the market share. I think that's more of what people say. Oh yeah, that's a bit different. But I also don't think they're useless. It's just it also doesn't give the whole picture. Yeah. But at least it's comparable. I think that's a good point there.
It's mostly used to determine, to discover the trend of whether you are, on an upward trajectory.
Yeah, that makes sense. In terms of VC, have you thought about other models besides what you did with, for example, Vue to make VoidZero happen?
Yeah, so my first conclusion is that the model that Vue uses is only scalable up to a certain threshold and is just not enough to support the amount of work that we intend to do with VoidZero. Right. And in a way, it's also because I personally know how difficult it is to scale with this model. Like Vue grew over the past 10 years to the state it is now. I would say it's pretty sustainable. Personally, I would say I'm pretty financially well off just because of all the work that I did with Vue. But that's just for me. Yeah. Like I also sponsor a number of developers out of my own pocket, but that's about it. I cannot afford to, say, hire 10 people to work on things just out of the sponsorship money. And in a way, also, a toolchain is harder to monetize in the same way that Vue does, because Vue as a framework interacts with developers more directly. Like this is one thing I've mentioned when I sort of people ask me for advice on independent open source projects. Like the abstraction layer your project sits at heavily affects your monetization strategy. So Vue, because it interacts with users so directly and it has great exposure, it makes sponsorship-based channels also, for example, endorsed content or like just putting up a banner in a way, like all these things is about exposure. Yeah. And because our documentation interacts with the users on a daily basis. That's why that's where the conversion happens. But for a dev tool, the conversion will be much, much lower because you sit at a lower layer. For example, if someone uses Vue with Vite, they set up Vite maybe once, and the rest of the time they mostly look at Vue documentation instead of Vue documentation. Right? So the conversion rate will also be different. So it will be even more difficult to make a tool chain sustainable based on the same model that Vue uses because they're just different things. Yeah. Right? It's kind of similar reasons why Babel has kind of always struggled with funding despite being wildly used. It's just like, it's crazy how Babel is literally at one point the universal tool chain for JavaScript. Somehow it struggled with funding.
I mean, same with like core.js, for example, where like polyfills are used in so many big projects, but lots of people are not aware. And I think especially like end users, developers, using, let's say, Meta framework, they might know much about Vite. So like, okay, it's using Vite. That's that.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, they're abstracted away in these end frameworks that just configures things for the users. And the user may not even know they're using Babel in a way.
Exactly. I mean, I also saw it, for example, with GT from UnJS, like, oh, it's using the esbuild now, but nobody knows these smaller packages because once again, we have so many dependencies as well. And I definitely see where then it's very difficult to like get money through sponsorships. And I also remember, so Next has been part of the GitHub Accelerator in the first cohort. And I mean, you also gave a presentation there and lots of people. And one of the takeaways I had there was like lots of people built a course around it or had any incentive for like, okay, sponsor me, so you get early access, or here's a freemium version and so on. And a lot of people tried to build a business around it because otherwise they couldn't really finance it. While you were in a way the odd one out, so to say, that it worked with sponsorships. But I guess, as you said, it's because you have like a end user facing framework in the end that's very popular. And of course, not everybody can say like, okay, I build another framework and do the same.
Right. In a way, Vue was able to do that because we reached popularity first, then we started become sustainable, right? In a way, it's also kind of a chicken and egg problem. For some projects, if you're not sustainable in the first place, you maybe cannot even persist until the day you get popular, right? Absolutely. And I think, so it's challenging, right? So at one point, I was also thinking, look, like JS infrastructure, maybe it's like better suited as a foundation, where you can get a bunch of companies pull money to do it. But usually this only happens when you have like really big companies like Google or Mozilla or Microsoft to pull money together. But the incentives behind foundations is also very complicated. It can get very political, and pulling the right strings to get them to work together to do this kind of thing usually depends on you are already the industry standard and you are facing sustainability problems.
It's more like as a solution out of the sustainability problems, they're already there. Like, let's donate this to Foundation X, create a new foundation, and I see.
So I don't really see us in the position to say, hey, we plan to build this, we're starting a foundation, you guys should pull money to do this. I just feel like it's compared to convincing VCs that there will be a monetization model on top of that, it's actually a more viable way compared to doing a foundation at this stage.
But would you think that could be like, let's say, plan Z or like C or whatever solution in terms of, let's say, worst case scenario, monetization doesn't work out for whatever reason, to switch to a foundation-like model?
I mean, that's definitely on the table. Like, even at a later stage, we could potentially, for example, like maybe not the best example, but like WordPress kind of separates.
Difficult right now.
Like, but not just WordPress. There are multiple companies who put the open source projects in a foundation, but then have a for-profit business entity, sort of leading and supporting the foundation. That model is possible. But at this stage, we're just focused on trying to get the monetization working first.
Of course, that totally makes sense. And you already mentioned there were quite some projects who got popular like after being popular and then sustainable. Other projects tried to do the same and failed. Now, especially in the unified toolchain category, let's say, there are a few that of course tried it. Like VoidZero is not the first attempt. So of course Rome is a very good example. But also to some degree, at least what Bun is trying to do, like the runtime part, but maybe could you outline differences, maybe also learnings from some of the projects that failed or still exist and what you do differently?
Yeah, sure. So first off with Rome, I'll have to be a bit direct here. I'm not criticizing specific people involved in the project, but I think it went some detour. First, Rome was started as a JavaScript-based implementation. They essentially gave up halfway and decided to rewrite everything in Rust. So that was already a lot of wasted time and energy, right? So by the time they started rewriting everything in Rust, they're back to ground zero with zero adoption, with nothing implemented. So they re-implemented the parser from the ground up, and finally got to the way of implementing a formatter, right? So that was the first usable thing that Rome produced. The thing about formatter is it's easily adoptable, so it's good to kind of validate your thing and get people using it. However, in my opinion, formatter is something with the lowest moat in terms of it's kind of detached from everything else from your build stack.
Yeah.
It's like I can switch a formatter anytime without incurring much thought. It's like I switched from Prettier to Biome today. It's easy, it's simple. It doesn't really involve anything else.
No high cost as well.
Yeah, which means if there is a better formatter coming up one day, I would have no problem switching Biome out for that formatter, right? So it's not going to, let's say you're building a company and you want people to keep using your stuff. The formatter really isn't the best thing to keep them for that purpose, right? So they did not get to build the rest of the thing, mostly because of operational issues. Honestly, I don't think they didn't even get to the part where they even started attempting to make money, right? So the company kind of folded before they got to that part.
Yeah.
And it's not because that the idea of a unified toolchain is wrong. I think it's mostly the execution, right? So it's unfortunate that the company folded, but it's really like the same idea carried out by a different group of people can have very different results.
Yeah, I mean, ideas are cheap, right? It's about execution in the end.
Yeah, there's no direct correlation between like, oh, because they did it and failed, like no one else can do it, right?
And so especially as a lot of people want that unified toolchain. I mean, people from other programming languages are laughing at JavaScript, like, oh, you don't have like cargo like in Rust, and like, oh. Yeah. So I think that the demand is definitely there for sure. Yeah. But yeah, it's a good point that like also let's say the difficult part and also the sustainability part that wasn't fully reached even.
Yeah. Yes. So I think one part is, the company, it just like imploded. The other side of it is the adoption profile of a formatter is just not the good entry point, in my opinion. Like I think it also depends on the specific ecosystem, right? So if you build a successful formatter and you follow up with other successful things, it may also work out, right? For example, I think Astro is doing this for the Python ecosystem, right? They build Rough, which is wildly successful, but then they got into UV, which is package management. Like, because the formatter is good for spreading awareness, right?
But you have to follow up also very quickly.
Yeah, so, you have to follow up with something that's more concrete, that solves more critical problems in the toolchain.
Just formatting,
Yeah, right? But compare that to VoidZero, right? We have Vite. And Vite is already solving a critical problem for a lot of people, right? So in a way, we have already crossed that 0 to 1 stage. Like, if we can enhance Vite with this new toolchain we're building, we have no problem of getting it into hands of millions of developers.
Because they already use it. Yeah. It's not like we have to gather the users. It's like, here's a new update, you go for it.
Yeah. So we don't have to worry about like, hey, here's a brand new Rust toolchain. Can you try it, please? Right? In a way, like we don't have to worry about that. We can focus on just building the best thing possible.
And I mean, you also have a lot of people being able to test it as well and like get feedback. I think that's also another part of like not only adoption, but get the whole framework together and say like, okay, this is what we need, or it doesn't work, or could you improve? So like also a lot of opinion can sometimes also be bad, but it's better having like a lot of people testing it and giving feedback.
One of the strengths of the Vite ecosystem is we have this kind of very close collaboration relationships with all the teams that are building on top of Vite. I talked to a lot of the stakeholders before I started the company, I make sure that everyone's aware that we plan to do this, right? So in the long run, I think they're on board with it because in the long run, it benefits their framework too, right?
So everybody was like mostly positive, saying, hey, great idea. Yeah. So that's also nice to like get, not saying approval, but like just let's say it's just temperature gauge of like what people think about it beforehand. And especially because you don't want to step on anyone's toes saying, oh, now framework XYZ might switch to whatever or build their own things because of that. So that's was definitely a good move, I would say. In terms of runtime, you said that VoidZero should be runtime agnostic.
Yeah.
So how do you compare it to something that Bun is doing with like also they're like all-in-one tool chain to some degree?
Yeah. So I think the positioning here is our goal is to build a tool chain that solves your problems in a way that would benefit you regardless of the framework you're using or the deployment targets you want to use, right? So as long as you are doing JavaScript, there is a way for you to benefit from the things that we build. Whereas I think for Bun and Dino, they are fundamentally runtimes. So in a way, the development experience or the tool chains integrated with the runtime is their way of offering more features or better development experience in order to get traction, to convert users from Node.js to use these different runtimes, right? So the purpose is a bit different, right? Because if I'm not mistaken, the ultimate monetization strategy for both Dino and Bun is to make people pay for hosting services that run Dino or Bun.
Yeah, like
right?
Oven, Dino Deploy, and so on.
Yeah, so their bet kind of hinges upon that people switching away from Node.js, their runtime end up being the winner in the ecosystem, and naturally, they wouldn't want their tool chain to be easily usable without actually using the runtime, which means all the tool chain used in Bun is coupled to Bun, right? So let's say you want to build your own analyzer for a very customized use case. oxc is a full list of crates that you can just pull out in your Rust projects, or we even have node packages, right? You can use oxc resolver, you can use oxc transform, oxc parser as standalone node packages as well. Nothing prevents you from doing that, right? And you would get the same behavior when you opt into the whole thing together, right? So it's kind of like a la carte. Like you have individual pieces or you opt into the whole thing. It's kind of like the same progressive framework idea that Vue kind of did.
Makes
right?
sense, yeah.
Whereas if you use Bun, you're opting into the whole box of things. Right, you want to stay in Bun as much as possible, and that's what Bun wants you to do.
Of course,
right?
like it's in a way also vendor lock-in, just from the runtime side in the end.
Yeah, and I think strategically nothing wrong for Bun to do that because that's their whole value proposition.
Yeah, sure.
But our starting point is just different.
And would you say there might be a way to be like, let's say, compatible with whatever Bun, Deno, and so on plan to do?
I think there are definitely good opportunities for example. If a runtime wants to leverage our toolchain to power their offerings, we're open to that, right? I don't think that's going to happen for Bun, right? But maybe for other runtimes.
Yeah, so the chance is there. It's probably just like, okay, talking, using it, and okay, that's nice. So there are a lot of questions, of course, from the community, and one of them is there a project that is, let's say, that exists right now and is the closest to what you imagine VoidZero would become one day?
I would say not. I don't think there is something that's very closely equivalent to what we have, the end goal that we have in mind.
Maybe in other languages besides Java?
Oh, you mean just if you're just talking about the toolchain part?
I would say in general, yeah.
Yeah, like cargo for Rust.
Yeah. So let's say the cargo for JavaScript.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not too bad. It's a catchy phrase. And are there any upcoming projects that can be closed source or open source that don't exist right now or that nobody's aware of and that should be or will be integral for VoidZero? So beyond the projects we have under the VoidZero umbrella right now. Yeah.
So obviously the long-term plans will likely change, but I think in general, if it's something that we distribute to users to run on your machine, it will likely be open source and free to use, right? If it's a paid thing, it will likely be hosted somewhere as a service.
Okay, that makes sense. So everything that's like closed source will probably not land in the end user's machine.
Closed source will because obviously in the early stages of the company, we discussed and explore all these different options, right? So I guess I don't want to lock myself into a box right now because the road is long.
True.
But honestly, open core, I don't think it's unlikely that we go with open core. drawing the line of arbitrary feature sets is just very difficult, especially for the kind of thing we do, right? Yeah. We don't want to create artificial barriers for people of adopting and using the things we build, and especially if it's we're building something for the ecosystem, right? So the ideal situation is the services that we build generates sustainable income for us to keep the toolchain free and open source forever.
Got it. And then you point out already, now we come to the topic that was the most asked question, of course, monetization. Like the big thing under your announcement tweet, under videos, under literally everything, also the Q&A tweet and post, like, oh, how will VoidZero make money? What's the business model and so on and so on. Maybe to start on that, you said in your announcement blog post, it will be focused on enterprise, so like solutions for enterprise.
Yeah.
Can you like outline a bit more on that? I mean, you said you have to be still a bit vague.
Yeah.
But I'm more than sure that people are curious to hear everything around it.
Yeah. The idea here is when we build a universal toolchain and assuming it becomes industry standard, it gives us great funnel, great conversion for literally any service that we build, right? So unfortunately, I cannot go into the very specific details about what exact service we plan to build because in a way, we don't want to like reveal it before it's actually ready. It ties into a lot of the business side of things, strategies,
sure.
like
competition,
potential competition and everything, right? But so first thing we want to assure people is we do have a plan. The second thing is if the plan goes well, or like even if the plan doesn't go well, like our bottom line is we want to retain the integrity of the open source efforts that we do, right? I think a lot of the reason people are curious about the money making part is like they worry about the long-term sustainability or like whether we will, because of the money making incentives, whether it will distort the open source parts, right? So one promise we can make is we'll never try to make money by switching licenses and force you to pay for something you're using for free today. That's just not going to happen, right? Everything we do is going to be value added on top. You opt into it. If you like it, you use it, you pay for it.
And I think like, especially at least my feeling is that a lot of people have trouble on like imagining how they will look like with a toolchain because let's say another example, Laravel Cloud got funding recently, also from Excel, of course. And there's like, okay, it's a product. Users can like subscribe, buy, whatsoever. It's rather clear. So as you said, there will be services. That's what you can share.
Yeah, I think if we make an analogy, right? For Laravel is the open source framework, and then Laravel Cloud is a service that you can potentially pay for, right? And many other Laravel services that you can pay for, right? Some close examples. I think it's actually pretty common, like NX. Has NX Cloud, Bit has Bit Cloud. They all have an open source component that you can use for free and get a certain level of benefits, right? And then it's enhanced when you combine it with a cloud service that you use, right? So I think there are plenty of opportunities when you have a full toolchain that covers all the aspects of your JavaScript development to build something like that. Right.
Yeah, probably also something to explore as well to see like, okay, what's possible, what's interesting as well for the enterprise customers. But would you say like, let's say a hobby developer having like a side project would also be up to use these services? Or is it like, let's say pricing tier wise really more catered towards enterprise?
I think most of the concerns we do plan to cover and monetize on probably applies more to enterprise environments or medium-sized and up production-oriented teams. Like you have real products that you have, software engineering quality concerns, essentially something that you deploy production and you're actually making money with it. Like it's a serious thing, and you want to make sure you deliver code more efficiently, better, more securely.
So it's more like that. The developer who has like a side project might not even need these services.
Yeah, you probably don't need these services, but you can still enjoy the open source things we build.
Totally.
Yeah.
Nice. So to keep VoidZero sustainable in a way, how do you roughly think about dividing the efforts and also funds? So you mentioned like sponsoring other projects. You hired some people from the Vite, the VTest, the RSpec, the oxc team who worked on RSpec before. So are there like any strategies how to continue doing that or how to advance that?
I think sponsorship is just a natural part of it because we do get value out of all the people who contribute to our projects, right? So it's just natural we need to do that as part of the responsibility of a company that's built on top of open source. I think long term, the people who are maintaining these open source projects today will likely keep doing that, right? We will have separate product development, but because for us, in order to make people trust our products and use our products in the future, the premise is built on we build good open source projects first.
Yeah.
Right. That's the whole strategy. That's the whole idea, is to make our open source stuff so good that everyone wants to use them, and then that becomes our conversion base for the paid product.
Got it. And I mean, then as I said, like sponsoring and like further improving open source is also part of it.
I think all the incentives just aligns.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about VoidZero and Vue, because you mentioned Vue also in the FAQ, the mini FAQ after the announcement blog post, and you said that Vue will be a first-class citizen of like VoidZero, of the projects in there. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit as what that exactly means for Vue?
So for Vue remains an independent project. Business aspect, in the business sense, it has nothing to do with VoidZero, but Vue's default build toolchain is based on Vite. So anything that VoidZero does to enhance Vite naturally benefits Vue users as well, right? So for me, I tend to think of Vue as a framework, as a vertical experience, which means if I'm working on something that, even if it's at a lower level, as long as it benefits Vue end users, right, that's also like, it's contributing to Vue in a way, right? So, and that's part of the reason why I built Vite, right? Sure. I built Vite to make the Vue development experience better, and I think that actually did, right? In a lot of ways.
Absolutely,
right?
yes.
So I believe what VoidZero is doing will also make Vue development experience better.
Yes, but it's not like it will only make Vue experience better, or
it'll make everyone's development experience better.
So would you say that it's like, because you said like Vue will be a first-class citizen, just means it won't be a second-class citizen, as in like it will...
So for example, if there are certain things we need to do to ensure the new things we build are compatible with the Vue plugin, or making sure like when we release a new version, we will always ensure Vue works smoothly with everything we've released. And the other aspect of it is there are a lot of AST manipulation and code generation things involved in the Vue compiler pass.
Yes.
Right. Some of those might be suitable for opting into the new toolchain. For example, we can use oxc's parser to do some of the parsing that we need to do in the Vue compiler. And if we provide more powerful primitives for doing transforms, we can use that in the Vite Vue plugin. We can leverage the new primitives offered through Vite to make the Vue SFC compilation more efficient.
Yeah. Right. So it's a bit like using it also as some kind of experimenting field as well. So like, okay, we have our new primitives, we have new functions, let's try them out. Like also you did with Rolldown already, for example.
Yeah, like we do actually, for example, like I used VitePress as kind of testing bed for a lot of Vite features during the 2.0 rewrite. We're likely going to do that for the Rolldown Vite as well. In fact, our Vite documentation already can run the VitePress build using Rolldown-powered Vite.
Nice. Yeah. That's a great achievement.
Yeah.
Sweet. So now with another project, and it's not, let's say, only is wrong there, but open source. It's a company, so a business. Yeah. How do you think that will maybe affect your, let's say, attention and time for Vue, but also for Vite? Because you have Rolldown, of course, you have everything under the VoidZero umbrella, so to say. So
I think naturally with the team growing, I think there are it's a role, a transition of role for me. Like, I think even within Vue, I kind of have transitioned a lot from pretty much handling everything hands-on to encouraging more team members to contribute. Like, in fact, if you look at the latest commits in Vue core, we have consistently have new active contributors joining. And a lot of times, especially in patch releases, I maybe only do one or two commits during a patch where the other like 8 to 10, a dozen commits from other contributors, right? So in a way, I want to not only do that for Vue, but also for Vite. In fact, Vite is already mostly team-driven. Look at the commits. I actually don't write much code for Vite directly anymore. So for me, I think part of the reason we're able to grow Vue and Vite into successful team projects, I don't want to like brag about it myself, but I think I have a knack for identifying good contributors and try to encourage them to grow into bigger roles.
Yeah.
Right? And I think I want to do that more at the company level. Like, we want to identify people who are passionate about these projects, give them the room to grow, to step into bigger roles. Because I'm just one person. The best way to scale what's in my brain is for me to able to focus on higher level directions, the big picture, and then finding the right people and put them in the roles that can sort of help me carry out that vision.
Because also delegating that, like
learning to delegate as a company founder, I think that's critical, and that's something I'm learning and trying to do more.
I think also in open source, as you mentioned, it's the same idea, right? You can't do everything alone. Like you have to have people trying docs, and it's so much, and especially at a certain popularity level, like in Vue and in Vite. It wouldn't work, and if you look at if you have a look at the Vite team, if you have a look at the Vue team, then that works out pretty well.
Yeah.
So I think at company level, this is at least something that is similar. Of course, different because there's still product, there's still business at some point behind it, but it's kind of similar as well.
I think I want to be able to use my time in the most valuable way possible. I think. In fact, like, I never consider myself the strongest in terms of raw technical skills, like implementing a hard algorithm or doing some crazy optimizations. Like, I can do that, but I'm probably not even the best engineer to do that kind of stuff. I think my kind of natural talent is probably in just like designing sensible APIs and finding good trade-offs and defaults, and to give the end user the best possible developer experience without compromising on the technical vision, right? So balancing all that is, I think, the best way to spend my energy at the moment. So, and then that also means it's a similar case for Vue. So I want to be 100% honest, because like starting the company definitely will reduce my attention that's allocatable to Vue to some extent, right? But doesn't mean Vue is going to be abandoned, right? So given my, as much attention I can give it to it, I will still make sure Vue evolves in a way that I see that's beneficial to the users.
Would you say that the amount of attention you can give to Vue is like comparable to, let's say, when you worked on Vite before, or like?
Yeah, I would say it's comparable. In fact, I think during the Vite 2.0 phase, I pretty much just like left Vue aside.
So you wouldn't say that would happen again?
I think right now I try to be more consistent, because in a way, I think also like I want to be kind of open about it. The idea here that an open source project needs, like, I think if it's just bug fixes, right, you do need constant attention, like small things coming in, you can fix it as they come. But I think for a project like Vue, right, it's stable, it's already fulfilling a lot of needs. In a way, we are not really looking to do really disruptive paradigm shift kind of changes in Vue, at least for the foreseeable future, right? Our focus is on incrementally improving everything, whether be it small quality of life improvements, making sure an old API works better in certain ways, or addressing some long-standing issues, or just like rewriting the internals to make it faster without you having to do anything, right? We're focusing on these kind of things. And in a lot of ways, because I think Vue status as an independent project and not a for-profit one actually affords us to take a pace that's different from a for-profit thing. Like when you see a framework that's being used as a funnel for a for-profit project, you naturally see you need to constantly be pushing for new things, keep it on the radar and make people excited all the time. In a way, maybe we have to do that for the new toolchain, but I think for Vue, we're not on a real pressure to do that. And I think that's fine. Like, in fact, I think for a lot of independent open source projects, it's fine for every single one of them to have different pace of their own. You can move as fast as you want, or you can move slow, as long as you believe you are doing your users right? And I think for a framework that's 10 years old, you don't necessarily want new big features coming out every month.
No,
that's actually tiring.
Yeah.
Right?
Also for the users, right?
Yeah.
Like, and also, I mean, Vue 2, Vue 3, of course, wasn't the easiest, and like having something that big of a change again would probably also hurt the user base as well, especially if there's no need to that.
Yeah.
So that definitely makes sense. Okay, let's come to a bunch of questions gathered from the community here and there. So a few people asked, what's the relationship to the UnJS project? Because also unified JavaScript system, maybe potential collaboration, even people are like, are they merging? So what's your take on that?
There isn't really a direct relationship. I think UnJS is more at the runtime level. It's like runtime libraries. For example, like Nitro is basically, plus actually the new project is like a unified server API, right? So this is more code that actually runs at runtime. So VoidZero is concerned more at the build, transform, and infrastructure tooling layer. So it's like language level support rather than just very specific things you want to do at a runtime, right? I think UnJS is more focused on the runtime part. I think maybe JD is a bit kind of related.
Yeah.
So I think, at one point JD probably should use oxc and Rolldown under the hood.
Yeah, let's see what we can do there.
Yeah, I mean, but other than that, I think UnJS is like sitting at the runtime layer, whereas VoidZero is like at the language toolchain layer.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Have you heard of the .config directory proposal, also from Puya, to select, hey, all the configs? Do you think that's something that also a unified toolchain could support?
I mean, of course, if we end up having a toolchain that covers all these concerns, it will probably just be one single config file.
Yeah. Or like even that like a .config folder to just like put, I don't know, your post CSS config in there, your, I don't know, tailwind config and whatnot, so you don't have to have it all at the top level project root.
Yeah, I guess .config works well as is now. I'm not sure if it needs to be part of the VoidZero scope, right? But for VoidZero, everything that we do cover, it will probably just be configurable in one single config file.
Do you plan migration paths, ideally smooth migration paths for other tools people use like SWC, esbuild, and so on and so on?
Rolldown actually is, specifically in terms of scope, is very similar to esbuild. So I think in a lot of cases, Rolldown's API is designed more modeled after rollups, but feature set-wise, it's very close to esbuild. So if you want, you can definitely migrate from esbuild to Rolldown. In fact, we do have a client that we're working with is specifically doing that because they want better chunking control, which esbuild has kind of a limitation with.
Yeah.
And for what's the SWC, I think for SWC, if you're using it as a transformer, the migration should also be quite straightforward because both oxc's transform and SWC's transform are like loosely modeled after Babel's. Right? So the options will be similar, the functionality will be similar. It will just be probably faster. So I also don't see a big problem there, and SWC also doesn't really have a bundler associated with it. I mean, there's TurboPack and RSPack, but they're not in the scope of SWC, right? So yeah, I think if you want to just use oxc instead of SWC as a parser or transformer, That should also be doable. In fact, there is a project that's doing that, which I cannot really tell you what it is now, but at a later stage, you will know.
Perfect, great. I'll definitely retweet that as soon as you announce it.
Okay, yeah.
Let's see. Okay, cheeky question. When Next.js will support Vite?
Probably never. Mostly because it's so hard, so deeply integrated with TurboPack, so it's just too deeply invested in that. I think we actually once did a prototype of running Next.js on Vite, and we got to the point where we can run the app router playground with like 80% of the features working exactly the same. The same code base, we just aliased it with something else. And we get running on Vite, but the internal differences are huge. At one point, I think it's just not really worth it on our side to pursue it further. And we did talk to Vercel about it, but they don't really seem that enthusiastic about it.
And their own tool in the pipeline,
yeah, which is understandable because like they've invested so much into TurboPack, right? I think for them, really, it's like they just want to get it to TurboPack to work nicely for Next.
Fair, but do you think that could, be a downside that like Next.js is the only bigger framework that's not, and then also on the unified toolchain?
I mean, for Next.js, probably is going to be a downside in the long run. Like, I think for the competitive advantage of other frameworks being built on top of Vite is they keep getting the benefits of everything we've built under hood for free pretty much. Yeah. But I mean, Vercel has a lot of money, so they invest into their own things, which they have more control over. Right?
Yeah, that's a benefit for them, right?
Yeah,
they own.
Because a lot of the Next.js internal logic is now like a lot of the Next.js specific transformers are coupled with SWC. So they were able to do that because they control all the way down to SWC, and I think for them at that time it was the only option because Vite really didn't have this kind of native toolchain back then.
Fair. oxc-lint, will oxc-lint support stylistic rules? After we heard like, esLint shouldn't be used for stylistic rules, Anthony Fu has now adopted all the stylistic rules there. What's your take on that?
I think the current focus scope of oxc-lint is pretty much artificial. It's mostly because the scope, we want to control the scope because the linter is not our primary focus right now. But, at a later stage, eventually we want the toolchain to be as complete as possible. So if stylistic rules, I think it kind of depends on demand. Like if as more people start using oxc-lint and a lot of users are asking for stylistic rules, then of course that can be put on the roadmap. But I think the bigger problem we want to tackle is performant type-aware linting, which is something we have discussed with the TypeScript team. And again, there are things I cannot talk about just yet. Yeah. But I think there will be interesting development in the future.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
So you also collaborated with the TypeScript team with Microsoft in that way?
I wouldn't say it's collaboration, but we are in a very close,
exchange.
We talk about the plans, making sure we don't, collide, or making sure it's compatible, making sure like we're not doing duplicated work.
Yeah. Also, when it comes to TypeScript checking itself, you always said that's more of an out-of-band thing to do, and that probably won't change for a while.
That won't change because making TypeScript type checking faster is a task that can only be achieved by the TypeScript team themselves.
So they should rewrite it to Rust, I see. No. Who knows? But that could be interesting. So in terms of formatting, people, of course, have very strong opinions what to use. Prettier is very popular. Will you just comply with the Prettier rules? Will you give some more customization, or so like whatever that's up to the end user?
I think the first version will likely just be a one-to-one Prettier compatible.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, formatting is naturally a bike shedding topic, right? Like, we don't really want to spend our energy on bike shedding for the users.
They're more interesting.
Pretty has already done that. Let's just do that.
That's true.
What they did.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, then two more. One that was quite interesting. So I saw there was a pull requests number 18,278 in Vite from you that changed the license. But to be fair, not like the license type, it's still MIT, but it changed from your name to VoidZero Inc. Could you briefly explain why it happened?
So I basically assigned the copyright that I previously owned in Vite to VoidZero, the company.
And like
that's it.
Why that?
Well, so that the company is now has better reasons to sponsor Vite's development. Because otherwise, it's my project technically, and it would be more like the company sponsoring a project that's actually controlled by me, where although I control the company, right, legality-wise, it's a bit of a gray area.
So it's more of a legal point of view.
Yeah, so assigning assigning the copyright, so basically the majority copyright of Vite now is held by the company, which means it's reasonable for the company to spend money on its further development.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then the last one is, when can we see a first version of Vite and Rolldown?
Well, there is in fact already a continuous release that's available through pkg.pr/new. We currently have a fork in Rolldown/Vite repository. If you're interested, you can check it out. It can already run most of the starter kits from the Vite create Vite templates. There are still some rough edges like consistent issues and resolver. So it actually already works to a certain extent, but there are some parts that we want to make more efficient, essentially. And some of that is kind of blocked by Rolldown, some of that just like Rust and JS interrupt. So some rough edges we need to iron out. I think we are trying to get some of the simple React SPAs in production to try to use it. But my hope is end of this year or early next year. Okay. We will have something more like an alpha or beta version that you can actually test in your project.
Sweet. Then very last question about hiring. So on your website on VoidZero, you said like you're hiring not for an active position, but whoever is, let's say, interested in low level, ideally experience with Rust, but also the vision of the big unified toolchain can apply.
In fact, what we said is we're not hiring.
Yes. No, you're not hiring for any position right now, but you could still send something over if you think that fits.
So essentially, we're looking for people who are just amazing and we feel like, wow, you would be immediately going to make an impact in the things we're trying to build, right? So that typically means you probably are already a pretty prolific contributor in open source. You've worked on, things. In fact, as you can tell, all of our hiring so far are made through open source channels.
Yes.
Right? So that's an important part of it. But then there are also people who may have worked in not open source projects, but have done really relevant work.
Let's say RSpec, for example, which is open source.
It's open source. But then there are, people who've worked on compilers, language toolchains.
Also outside of JavaScript as well.
Yeah, again, there are no I can't really give you a really clear criteria of what you need to do in order for us to be interested. Yes. But we do get, we've got more than 20 emails, and there are a few interesting people.
Okay, that's nice to hear.
Yeah, but again, the purpose of that is we want to start talking with these interesting people and keep the channel open, and at a later stage when the company grows further and we open up more headcount, we'd be ready to get them on board.
But probably also same for part of the Vites team, more people from the Vite team and so on. So it's also planned probably to hire some more people from them.
Yeah, or we increase the sponsorship as the company scales.
Makes sense. Evan, thank you so much for the interview. I hope for you out there all the questions are answered. Otherwise, just let us know. And thank you so much.
Thank you.